The wind off the Atlantic had a bite to it that morning, sharp enough to slip under the collar of Emily Carter's denim jacket and make her shiver. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the worn asphalt ribbon of Route 1 curved along the Maine coastline. The trees were in the thick of their autumn fire, blazing oranges, reds and golds that shimmered in the pale light. Normally, she would have rolled down, the window breathed it in, maybe even taken a photo. But today her mind was too heavy for scenery. Boston was now 2 hours behind her, but the weight she carried hadn't lessened with the miles. She could still hear her boss's carefully measured voice from last week, phrases like downsizing and budget restructuring meant to soften the blow. The cardboard box of her personal items still sat in the back seat, its contents rattling with every bump in the road. On top of that came the breakup, if you could call it that, 3 days later. Mark had managed to make the conversation sound like a mutual decision. It wasn't. She'd been left without a job, without a relationship, and without the faintest clue of what to do next. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with her mother's name, Mom. "Hey, honey." Rachel's voice was warm, like it always was. But Emily could hear the undercurrent of concern. "How far are you?" "About 15 minutes out," Emily said, keeping her tone even. "Good. Your dad's out back fixing the gutter, but I'll have coffee ready when you get here. Drive safe, Em." "Yeah. See you soon." She ended the call before her voice could crack. The Carter family home came into view like something out of an old New England postcard. A white 2-story house with navy blue shutters and a wraparound porch. It sat on a small bluff overlooking the harbor. Fishing boats bobbed in the distance, their hulls clinking against the docks. The salty tang of the sea mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Emily parked in the gravel driveway and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front porch steps. Coming home was supposed to feel comforting. Instead, it made her feel like a teenager again, unsure of herself, already rehearsing what she would and wouldn't say. Her mother appeared at the door, waving with both hands, a smile that reached her eyes. Rachel's strawberry blonde hair was tied back in a messy bun, a navy sweater hanging loosely on her frame. "Come on in before you freeze out there." Emily managed a small smile, stepping into the warmth of the house. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her boots hit her like a wave of nostalgia. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee, with that underlying scent that belonged only to this house, salt air soaked into the wood over decades. The kitchen looked the same as it always had, white cabinets, mismatched mugs hanging from hooks, and a stack of recipe cards worn at the edges. On the counter, a steaming mug waited for her. The handle turned toward her left hand, the way her mom always remembered she preferred. "Thanks, Emily," said softly, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic and letting the warmth seep in. Rachel leaned against the counter, watching her. "Rough week, huh?" Emily exhaled, staring into the dark swirl of coffee. "That's one way to put it." "You don't have to talk about it yet," Rachel said gently. "Just know that you're home. That's what matters." From the back door came the sound of boots on the porch, then the screen door banging shut. Thomas Carter entered, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was more gray than she remembered, his weathered face set in its usual expression of quiet reserve. "Em," he said with a short nod, "good to see you." "You too, Dad." They hugged briefly, awkwardly, but she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes before he turned away. Was it relief or just surprise that she was here at all? That night, Emily lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the faint glow of the harbor lights through the window. The room was smaller than she remembered, the posters from high school long gone, replaced with bare cream-colored walls. Her old bookshelf still stood in the corner, holding dusty trophies from swim meets and a scattering of novels she'd meant to reread someday. She rolled over and picked up her phone, scrolling through job listings in Boston, then closing the app almost immediately. The thought of going back there, of walking the same streets with nothing to return to, made her chest tighten. Her eyes landed on the small framed photo on her nightstand, her grandmother, Margaret Carter, smiling in the garden behind this very house. The photo was taken years before Emily was born, but she'd grown up hearing stories about her. Margaret had been elegant in a way that seemed effortless, always humming some tune under her breath. She'd passed away when Emily was 12, leaving behind recipes, knitted scarves, and a few scattered trinkets. For some reason tonight, Emily found herself lingering on that smile in the photo. It was the same smile that had appeared in her dreams, from time to time, a little wistful, like it held something unsaid. The next morning, she decided to take a walk through the town before breakfast. The streets were quiet, the shops just opening. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls echoing off the clapboard buildings. She passed the bakery where she used to buy blueberry muffins on Saturdays, with her mom, the bookstore that still had the same crooked open sign in the window. It was then she heard it faint at first, drifting from somewhere ahead. A melody, slow, delicate, and hauntingly familiar. She couldn't place it at first, but with every step the sound grew clearer, threading its way into her chest, like a memory she'd forgotten she had. Her feet carried her toward a narrow storefront she didn't remember seeing before. The sign above the door read, "Adams Antiques," the gold lettering faded, but still elegant. In the window, sunlight caught on glassware, old picture frames, and stacks of books with cracked spines. The music seemed to be coming from inside. Emily hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She told herself she was just curious, just killing time. But deep down, she knew there was something in that music, something that felt like it was calling her. She pushed the door open, and a small bell above it chimed. The scent of old wood and polished brass enveloped her. And there, on a shelf near the back, she saw it for the first time, a wooden music box carved with the image of a single rose. The tiny dancer inside spun slowly to the melody she hadn't heard since. Her breath caught. It was the same tune her grandmother used to hum when she was a child. And just like that, Emily's life began to shift, though she couldn't yet see how much. The bell above the door chimed a second time as the wind pushed it farther open behind her, and then the sound settled into the edges of the melody, twirling through the shop. Dust motes swam in the slant of morning light, turning the place into a slow-gliding snow globe of glass wood and time. Emily shut the door gently and stood very still, as if spooking the music might make it stop. She didn't move toward the shelf right away. Instead, she let her eyes adjust to the layers, a wall of gilt frames stacked like fallen dominoes. A tray of brooches that caught the light in quick flashes, a cluster of porcelain teacups in blues and whites, a map of New England browned at the creases and soft at the edges with the weight of too many fingers tracing routes. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, the pleasant papery breath of history. A voice drifted from behind the counter. "Take your time," it said, thin but bright, like a string bowed gently across a violin. "Things have a way of finding you if you let them." Emily looked up. The man who stepped into view had the softness of someone who'd been careful with delicate things for a very long time. He was tall and spare, with a cream-colored cardigan buttoned crooked over a pale shirt. His hair was silver and fine, smoothed back from a high forehead. Wire-rimmed glasses rested halfway down his nose, and behind them, his eyes were unexpectedly ocean blue. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Henry Adams." "Hi," Emily replied, embarrassed by the breathlessness in her voice. I heard the music." "People usually do," Henry said, amused. "It's over there back left, the rose." Emily followed the line of his pointing hand to the small wooden box nestled between a brass ship's compass and a crystal paperweight. Up close, the carving was startlingly fine petals folding over one another, the stem wrapping around the lid in a looping curl. The wood was dark, almost wine-colored, with a patina that spoke of countless palms smoothing across its surface. The tiny ballerina inside, no bigger than Emily's thumb, revolved slowly on a pin. A miniature spotlight from the window skimmed her painted face, the neat sweep of her bun, the gold flecks on her tutu. Emily's fingers hovered over the box. The melody wove itself around her, that slow, familiar braid of notes. She remembered being small and warm under a quilt, her grandmother's voice humming against the shell of her ear, the patient repeating tenderness of the tune. She swallowed hard. "May I?" she asked, even though it was already playing. "Of course." Henry stepped closer, but not too close. He seemed to have a sense for how much space people needed. "It's a good one. A little stubborn sometimes, like it refuses to be rushed." Emily brushed the lid with her fingertips. "What is it called?" Henry tilted his head, listening. "It's an arrangement of Clair de Lune, I believe, though whoever made this added a turn in the middle, a tiny flourish. Handmade movements will do that. They sneak in an extra heartbeat." Emily let herself smile. "It's beautiful." "Came in. Oh, let me think." Henry tapped the edge of the counter with one finger, counting backwards in his mind. 8, maybe 9 years ago. A gentleman brought it. Not the sort who collects more, the sort who lets go. He said it needed a quieter home for a while. He smiled at the memory. I told him that was the first time anyone used the word quiet as a selling point in a negotiation. Emily tore her eyes away from the dancer. "Did he leave a name?" "Not for me," Henry said. "He did mention the previous owner, Margaret Carter." He glanced up, and in that heartbeat, the shop fell away. The syllables landed like a touch to the inside of her wrist. "Margaret Carter," Emily repeated carefully. "That's what he said," Henry replied. "Mean anything to you?" "Yes," she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended. "She was my grandmother." In the pause that followed, the ballerina kept turning, as if refusing to be surprised by anything. Henry's face softened into something like wonder. "Well," he said gently, "there you are." Emily reached out and closed the lid. The music dimmed, then settled into silence like a bird folding its wings. Her pulse was in her throat. "I never saw this at her house." "It doesn't mean it wasn't hers," Henry said. "People tuck their tenderness away. They pass it along only when they think it's ready to be heard." "Do you know where it came from?" before Emily asked. "I mean originally, who made it? Somewhere in Europe, most likely." Henry said, turning the box carefully so she could see the underside. "Look here." A small oval of brass was set into the base, the winding key fitted snugly in a narrow slot. Beneath it, faint but legible, was an engraving R. Dupré Paris. And next to that, handwritten in an old-fashioned ink, just 2 initials, MM. Emily felt her breath catch. MM. Sometimes, Henry said, initials stand for the maker, and sometimes for the person who loved it enough to put their name on it. Emily ran her fingertip lightly over the letters. The edges were softened with time. It might have been a maker. It might have been her grandmother, before Carter was. Carter before she became anyone's mother or anyone's anything. Margaret who, Margaret what? Miller Mason. The question sprang up as if they'd just been waiting for a reason to be born. She set the box back down. "How much is it?" Henry smiled, the kind of smile that meant he had already decided. For most people, he said, that would be a very immodest number. For a granddaughter, it's the price of a conversation. Emily blinked. "A conversation between you and the past?" Henry said matter-of-factly. "Consider it an introduction fee." His eyes twinkled, then sobered. "I'll tell you what I know. Which, to be candid, isn't much. The man who brought it was middle-aged, nervous hands, careful voice. He wouldn't say why he was selling, only that he didn't want it thrown out if things went sideways. His phrase, not mine. He said the previous owner had passed. He knew her name. He knew the tune. That was enough to make me keep it in the quiet corner for the right person to find. Emily stared at him, some part of her wanting to laugh at the simplicity of his faith, and another part wanting to sit on the floor and cry into the hem of her sweater. The right person, she echoed. Antique shops are like chapels for the misplaced, Henry said, folding a polishing cloth neatly in half. If you stay long enough, you'll always hear a prayer answered. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she nodded, looked back at the rose, and reached for her wallet. Henry wrapped the box with a reverence that made Emily ache. He nested it in tissue paper with tiny music notes printed on it. How did he even have that? And set the parcel into a plain brown bag, the kind with twine handles. He slid a small envelope across the counter, too. A care card, he said, as if she were adopting a cat. How to wind it, how not to overwind it, how to keep the gears from getting temperamental. And my number. If the music falters, bring it back. I'll coax it. Thank you, Emily said. The words felt inadequate for the weight of what she was taking with her. Before you go, Henry added, almost as an afterthought, I should mention there's a catch. Emily's stomach tightened. A catch? He lifted the box gently from the bag and turned it in his hands. Here, he said, tapping the seam where base met body. Someone added a false bottom. See how the grain misaligns, just a breath? I'd guess there's a compartment. It's clever flush enough that you'd never feel it unless you knew. It'll open with the right pressure or a key. The mechanism is old. You don't want to pry. Her heart skittered. A hidden compartment, I'd wager so, Henry said. I've seen enough of them to know people like to keep letters close to the songs that held them. Do you have the key? Henry's mouth turned rueful. If I did, I'd have the story, and then what would you come back for? He shook his head. No key came with it. But compartments tend to match their keepers. If your grandmother wanted something found, she left a trail. If she wanted it kept, well, then the music is the message. Emily felt a tremor run the length of her arms. Not fear exactly, but that unsettled electric feeling a person gets when a door they didn't know existed opens a crack somewhere in the house of their life. She watched Henry nestle the box back into the tissue, watched his careful hands make the paper creak and hush. At the door, she hesitated. Henry? He looked up. If the man ever comes back, the one who sold it, could you call me? She scribbled her name and number on the corner of the care card before she could overthink it. In case he remembers anything else. I can, and I will, Henry said. But I'd advise you not to wait on him. Sometimes the person we think is holding the missing piece is really just the one who handed it to us. Emily nodded, throat tight. Thank you. For today. For letting the music play. Henry's smile was small and kind. It was waiting for you. That's all I did. When she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the light had shifted. The sound of gulls and the distant hammer of a boatyard fell into place around her like a new frame. She stood for a moment with the bag warm in her hands, from where Henry's palms had rested it. Then she started toward home. The street, the harbor, the paperweight blue sky, none of it had changed. But the world felt threaded differently now, as if someone had run a silk ribbon through the ordinary and pulled, gathering it closer to the shape of a secret. Emily walked with the steady, cautious care of a person carrying something breakable and necessary. And in the quiet between her footsteps, she could swear she heard, faint as a breath, the music continuing, patient as a heartbeat waiting for what would come next. The late afternoon sun slanted across the harbor. By the time Emily reached home, the bag from Adam's Antiques swinging lightly at her side. She could still feel the slight weight of the music box, denser than its size suggested, as though it carried not just brass and wood, but something intangible, like an unspoken sentence that had been hanging in the air for years. Her mother was in the kitchen when she came in, sleeves rolled up kneading dough on the counter. The warm scent of yeast and rosemary filled the air. "Find something interesting in town?" Rachel asked without looking up. "Maybe," Emily said, setting the bag down gently, almost protectively. "An antique. It belonged to Grandma." That made her mother glance up, her hands still buried in flour. "Margaret?" Her tone was cautious, but her eyes flicked toward the bag with a quick spark of recognition. Or was it worry? What kind of antique a music box? Emily replied. She waited for her mother to say something else. But Rachel only nodded once, as if filing the information away, and went back to her dough. Upstairs in the quiet of her childhood bedroom, Emily set the box on her desk. She peeled back the tissue paper, the faint crackle making the moment feel ceremonial. The carved rose seemed to glow in the amber light from the desk lamp. She traced the petals with her fingertip, following the curve down to the stem curling around the lid. There was a softness to the wood that came only from years of touch. She wound the key once, twice, and then released it. The first notes unfurled into the room like a breath. That haunting, lilting arrangement of Claire de Lune, but gentler, almost as if someone had taught the melody to whisper. Emily closed her eyes. She was 5 again, tucked under the quilt in the guest room, where she sometimes slept when her parents worked late. Her grandmother's voice had been low and warm, humming this very tune as she smoothed a hand over Emily's hair. She never sang the words, only the melody, pausing now and then to press a kiss to her forehead. Back then, Emily had thought it was just a pretty lullaby. Now she wondered if it had been a language all its own. The dancer spun her gold-flecked tutu, catching glints of light, her painted smile serene. Emily leaned closer, watching the mechanical grace of each turn. The melody filled the space between the walls, soft but insistent, and she felt it stirring something she hadn't realized she'd been keeping locked away, a yearning she couldn't yet name. Her eyes drifted to the underside of the box, to where Henry had shown her the faint seam. She ran her thumb over it. A false bottom, a compartment. The thought sent a tiny jolt through her equal parts curiosity and unease. What could be hidden inside? Why would her grandmother keep it secret? She pressed gently along the seam, trying to feel for any give in the wood. Nothing. The grain stayed stubbornly smooth, the compartment, if it existed, keeping its silence. The music wound down, each note stretching thinner until it was a ghost of itself, and then stopped. The dancer froze mid-turn, her tiny painted eyes fixed somewhere beyond Emily's shoulder. Emily exhaled slowly. She'd been holding her breath. That night, sleep came in fits. In one dream, she was back in her grandmother's garden, the air thick with the scent of peonies. The music box sat on a wrought iron table, open and playing, though the dancer was gone. Instead, her grandmother sat across from her, smiling that wistful smile Emily remembered from the photograph. She reached out a hand, palm up, as if offering something. But before Emily could take it, the dream dissolved into the sound of gulls outside her window. In the gray-blue light of early morning, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed with the box in her lap. The quiet of the house made the whole moment feel fragile, as though one loud sound might shatter it. She turned the key and let the melody begin again. This time she listened not just to the notes, but to the pauses, the way the song seemed to breathe. She realized with a small start that the extra flourish Henry mentioned, a tiny run of notes near the middle, was the same way her grandmother had always hummed it. Not an accident. A choice. A signature. She whispered into the room. "What were you trying to tell me, Grandma?" Of course there was no answer, only the steady turning song as if the box itself were content to keep the truth for now. When the last note faded, Emily set the music box back on the desk. But the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was charged as though the melody had left a thread stretched taut between her and the past. She didn't know yet what she would find on the other end of it. But she knew she had to follow it. And that somehow the key to that hidden compartment and whatever lay inside wasn't going to be just a piece of metal. It was going to be a story. A story her grandmother had meant her to hear. One that was only beginning. The smell of coffee drifted through the house when Emily came downstairs. It was Saturday, the kind of crisp Maine morning when the air bites your cheeks, but the sunlight tricks you into thinking it's warmer than it is. She found her father at the kitchen table, hunched over a local paper, reading glasses low on his nose. A steaming mug sat within reach, his fingers wrapped around it like it might anchor him to the day. Thomas Carter was not a man of many words. He was deliberate, measured, and tended to keep his thoughts sealed behind the same expression he wore now, calm but not quite warm. Emily had always known him as dependable, the type who fixed the leaky roof before the rain came, the type who remembered the oil change but forgot her high school art exhibit. She poured herself a cup, sliding into the chair across from him. The music box was upstairs in her room, but its presence felt tangible, as if it had followed her down, humming silently between them. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning." She stirred her coffee, watching the swirl. "Hey, Dad, I found something yesterday, in town." He flipped a page of the paper. "A music box," she said, letting the words settle. "It used to belong to Grandma Margaret." That made him pause. His eyes lifted over the top of the page, narrowing just a fraction. Where in an antique shop? Henry Adams's place. She took a sip to hide the sudden dryness in her mouth. He said it came in years ago. It has her name, well, her initials on it. Thomas set the paper down slowly, folding it once, twice into a neat rectangle. I don't know why he'd say that. Because it's true, she offered, keeping her tone light, but her gaze steady. It plays the same tune she used to hum to me when I was little. Exactly the same. His jaw flexed. He reached for his coffee again, staring into it, as if the right words might float to the surface. "Emily, some things, they're just old family possessions. They don't mean anything." "They mean something to me," she said, a little sharper than she intended. "I never saw it here growing up." Did she keep it somewhere else? Was it important to her? Thomas shook his head, but it wasn't the firm, dismissive kind. It was slower, heavier, like the weight of a memory he didn't want to set down. "Your grandmother. She didn't talk about her past much, not to me. She was private. She was private, or you didn't ask." His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment she thought she'd gone too far. But instead of snapping, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossing loosely. "I learned early in life that pushing her on certain topics was like pushing against a locked door. You can bruise your shoulder, or you can walk away." Emily set her mug down carefully. What if she locked that door for a reason? And what if I need to know what's behind it? Why? The question came out quiet, not accusing, but it still hit her like a challenge. She hesitated. "Because it feels like she left something unfinished, and I think it's meant for me to finish." Thomas's gaze drifted to the window where gulls were wheeling over the harbor. "You think finding out whatever she kept to herself will change something now?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But not knowing feels worse." Rachel's footsteps came down the hall, and she appeared in the doorway, hair still damp from the shower. She glanced between them, sensing the air had thickened. "What's going on?" she asked. Emily found a music box, Thomas said, not looking away from the gulls. Rachel's brows knit slightly. A music box. In Henry Adams' shop, Emily supplied. He said it belonged to Grandma. Something unreadable passed over Rachel's face, gone as quickly as it came. Well, that's interesting. Do you know anything about it? Emily pressed. Her mother dried her hands on a dish towel, stalling. I remember she had one, yes. She didn't keep it out in the open. Why not? Rachel glanced at Thomas. He gave a small shake of his head. It wasn't angry, it was something else. Protective, cautious. She had her reasons, Rachel said at last, her voice even. Margaret was complicated. Strong, but complicated. That's not an answer, Emily said, her frustration rising. You're both talking like you know more than you're willing to say. Thomas's chair scraped back as he stood. Because some stories aren't ours to tell, and maybe they're better left untold. He took his mug to the sink, rinsed it, and left the kitchen without another word. Emily stared at the folded paper he'd left behind, the crisp lines of the fold, as precise as everything else he did. Her mother came to sit beside her, lowering her voice. Your father and your grandmother, they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. Sometimes silence was their truce. That's supposed to help me? Emily asked, half laughing, half hurting. Rachel's hand rested briefly on hers. It's supposed to explain why he reacts the way he does. Just be patient with him. Emily thought of the seam on the bottom of the music box, the compartment Henry had pointed out. Patience isn't going to open that door, Mom. Her mother's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that told Emily she was right. No, Rachel agreed quietly. It's not. Later in her room, Emily sat with the music box in her lap. She could still hear her father's voice saying some stories aren't ours to tell. Maybe not. But this one felt like it was hers now, whether anyone liked it or not. She turned the key and let the melody play, the sound curling through the air like a hand beckoning her forward. Somewhere hidden in the wood and brass and the spaces between the notes, the truth was waiting. And she was going to find it. It rained the next morning, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the line between ocean and sky. The kind of rain that kept most people inside, but for Emily, it felt like an invitation. Days like this always made her want to wander through the quieter corners of the house, the places that smelled of dust and cedar and faintly of the sea. The attic had been her favorite place as a child. Back then, it was in adventure boxes stacked like treasure chests. Old coats draped over trunks, light seeping in through the small round window. She hadn't been up there in years. Now standing at the bottom of the pull-down ladder, she hesitated. It felt different to be here with questions pressing at her. She pulled the cord. The ladder groaned down, and a draft of cool, dry air drifted past her. Carrying a small flashlight, she climbed into the dim space above. The smell hit her first, old wood fabric, a hint of mothballs. Dust floated in the beam of her light, turning slowly like tiny planets. Boxes were labeled in her grandmother's precise handwriting. Winter coats, Christmas ornaments, canning jars. She ran her hand along a wooden trunk and felt the slight ridges of carved initials, MC. She started with the nearest box, flipping open the lid to find stacks of faded linens. The next held books with cracked spines, a few, with pressed flowers between the pages. Her flashlight passed over an old hat box, then landed on a small tin container, the kind that might have once held biscuits or sewing supplies. It was tucked behind a larger box, as if someone had placed it there deliberately out of sight. Emily pulled it toward her and blew the dust off the lid. The tin was painted a deep teal with tiny flecks of gold along the rim. The latch was stiff, but it popped open with a metallic click. Inside was an assortment of odds and ends, a lace handkerchief, 2 theater ticket stubs so faded she could barely read the dates, a Polaroid of a smiling young woman she didn't recognize, and nestled in the corner, a small brass key. She picked it up, holding it under the flashlight. The head was oval-shaped with delicate etching along the edges, and in the center, the letters MM, the same initials she'd seen on the underside of the music box. Her breath caught. She turned the key over in her hand, wondering if it could be. It had to be. Henry's voice echoed in her memory. If your grandmother wanted something found, she left a trail. This felt like a trail. Emily set the tin aside and kept searching her curiosity, pulling her deeper. Beneath the other items in the tin, she found an envelope sealed and yellowed with age. No name, no address, just the faint impression of a rose pressed into the paper, as if someone had used the lid of the music box itself as a seal. She didn't open it. Not yet. Something told her it might not be time. The rain tapped on the roof above, steady as a heartbeat. Emily sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the brass key warm in her palm. She thought of her grandmother moving through this same house decades earlier, choosing what to hide and where to hide it. Had she imagined this moment? Had she wanted Emily, specifically Emily, to be the one to find it? The thought made her chest tighten in a way that was both ache and comfort. Back in her room, she placed the key on the desk beside the music box. For a long moment, she just looked at them together. The carved rose and the brass oval, as if their reunion after all these years was somehow her doing. She could feel her pulse quicken. With a careful breath, she turned the box over, found the tiny seam Henry had shown her, and tried the key in a barely visible slot near the winding mechanism. It slid in smoothly, almost too smoothly, and with a soft click, the false bottom shifted. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, its edges frayed. A pressed white rose lay on top, brittle but intact. Emily lifted it with both hands, as if afraid it might crumble. Underneath the paper waited, holding its secret. She unfolded it. There was only a single sentence written in her grandmother's looping script. "The truth is in New York, find David Miller." Emily's pulse roared in her ears. The name was unfamiliar, but the directive was clear. Her grandmother, who had been silent about her past, had left this. Not for Thomas, not for Rachel. She'd hidden it in the one thing she knew Emily would never be able to resist opening if she found it. Emily sat back, the rain still whispering against the windows. Somewhere in New York was the next piece of the story. Somewhere someone named David Miller was holding the part of her grandmother's life that no one here seemed willing to speak about. She set the note down, wound the key, and let the music play. The melody filled the room again, sweet and patient, as if it had been waiting for her to be ready. Now she was. The rain had slowed by afternoon, leaving the air outside heavy with the scent of wet pine and salt from the harbor. Emily sat at her desk, staring at the folded note and the small brass key lying beside the open music box. Her grandmother's handwriting slanted graceful. Unmistakably, hers still felt warm in her mind, like a voice that had just spoken. "The truth is in New York, find David Miller." The name sat there like a stone dropped in water, sending ripples through her thoughts. She picked up the tin box again, the one she'd found in the attic, and emptied its contents onto the desk. The lace handkerchief, the faded ticket stubs, the Polaroid of the smiling young woman she didn't recognize, all slid across the surface in a small heap. Then at the very bottom, she noticed something she hadn't before: a narrow envelope stuck flat against the inside wall of the tin, as if it had been pressed there for decades. The paper was brittle and yellowed, the flap sealed with a faint trace of wax that had long since cracked. Her fingers hesitated at the seam. There was a small part of her that wanted to run downstairs and hand it to her parents. But she knew exactly how that would go, her father closing off her mother, offering half-truths. No, This was hers now. She slid her nail gently under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery folded twice. The scent of old paper rose faintly, mixed with something floral lavender, maybe that made her throat tighten. She unfolded the letter carefully, trying not to tear the edges. The handwriting was her grandmother's again, but the tone was different. Less measured, more urgent. March 15th, 1966. David. By the time you read this, I will be gone from New York. I don't know if we will see each other again. There are things I cannot write plainly because if this letter is ever found, it could hurt people I love. But you must believe me when I say I am doing this for them, and for you too, in a way. Keep the photographs safe. One day someone will come looking not for me, but for the truth. If they use my name and yours, you will know they are meant to hear it. There is a song in the music box. It will tell them more than my words ever could. Yours always. Margaret Emily read it twice, 3 times. Each time she felt the same knot in her chest pulled tighter. Keep the photographs safe. She glanced back at the pile on her desk at the Polaroid. But the Polaroid wasn't of her grandmother. It was of a man in his 20s, dark hair curling at the edges, his smile wide and easy. He was standing beside her grandmother in the picture. Though Margaret looked different, her hair longer, looser, her dress bright with a floral pattern. The two of them stood in front of a jazz club marquee lit up with the words, "One Night Only." Maggie Miller. Emily's eyes fixed on that name. Miller. M.M. The initials on the brass key, the initials on the music box. She leaned closer to study the background. The marquee was framed by a busy street scene, yellow cabs, men in fedoras, a newspaper stand on the corner. It was New York, definitely New York. But it looked like a slice from another world, another life. She flipped the photo over. On the back, written in the same looping script, were the words, "Our last night before everything changed." Her grandmother's smile in the photo was radiant, but Emily noticed something now she might have missed before there was a tension in her eyes, as though she already knew what was coming. Emily set the photo down next to the letter, staring at them both. Questions spun in her head. Who was David Miller to her grandmother? A friend? A lover? The way they stood close in the photo shoulders, brushing hands nearly touching, suggested something deeper. And what had changed after that night? Her mind flickered to the name in the note, "Find David Miller." Was he even still alive, if he was? Would he talk to her, or would he be just like her father, protecting the silence as if it were a treasure? The sound of footsteps in the hall snapped her back. She shoved the letter and the photo into a notebook and closed it, just as Rachel's voice called from the doorway. Dinner's ready. I'll be down in a minute," she said, hoping her voice sounded normal. Her mother lingered for a second, eyes flicking toward the desk, then nodded and left. Alone again, Emily opened the notebook and looked at the photograph once more. She imagined her grandmother in that moment, on the cusp of giving up a life in New York, a music career, maybe even love. The song in the music box was supposed to tell her more. But how could notes and melody explain why someone would walk away from all of that? Her grandmother had trusted David Miller with the truth. And now, decades later, she was trusting Emily to find him. Emily felt the decision take shape inside her, like a chord resolving. She wasn't going to let the trail go cold. She picked up her phone, opened her laptop, and began to search David Miller New York Jazz Club, 1960s. Page after page of results flickered across the screen. Too many Millers, too many dead ends. But the marquee in the photo gave her another lead. She zoomed in on the club's name, the Blue Lantern. A quick search told her it had been a small jazz venue in Greenwich Village, popular in the 60s, closed down in the early 70s. She found an old black and white photo of the exterior online, and her heart skipped. It was the same building from her grandmother's photo. And in a scanned newspaper article from 1965, she saw the words, "Local talent Maggie Miller wows crowd at Blue Lantern debut." It was her. Younger, radiant eyes full of something Emily couldn't name. She closed her laptop and leaned back, the rain starting again outside. The pieces were coming together, the music box, the initials, the key, the letter, the photo, the club. And always at the center, her grandmother's voice humming a tune that had somehow carried across decades to find her. New York wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It was the next chapter. And Emily knew she was going to turn the page. Emily sat back in her chair, the letter and photo spread before her, like two puzzle pieces that clearly fit together but left most of the pictures still missing. The rain outside had shifted into a harder rhythm, drumming against the glass. She could feel the questions tightening around her, the same way the air seemed to close in before a storm. She picked up the photo again, holding it at arm's length. The man David she assumed had that kind of charm in his face that made you feel he could talk his way into or out of anything. His arm wasn't around Margaret's shoulders, but it might as well have been. They leaned toward each other just enough to suggest gravity. Margaret Maggie Miller, the Marquis called her, was mid-laugh, the kind of laugh that made her whole face come alive. Emily couldn't remember ever seeing her grandmother laugh like that. She traced the edge of the photo with her thumb. There was no date printed on it, but the letter's date, March 15th, 1966, meant this was taken right before her grandmother left New York. Our last night before everything changed. The words written on the back felt heavier now, each one carrying more than it said. She turned back to the letter. The sentences were careful, like someone trying to tell the truth in a room full of listening walls. I am doing this for them, and for you too, in a way. Who were them? Emily's father, his siblings. Was her grandfather part of this? Or someone else entirely? The thought that her grandmother might have loved someone before her grandfather wasn't shocking in itself. Margaret had been young once, after all, but the way she'd erased this part of her life from the family's knowledge made it feel intentional. And intentional meant important. Emily's gaze slid to the music box on the desk. It sat closed quiet now, but she knew the song was in there waiting. Her grandmother's note to David had said, "There is a song in the music box. It will tell them more than my words ever could." She wound the key and opened the lid. The melody spilled out again, filling the room with its familiar, aching beauty. She imagined David Miller hearing it for the first time, maybe in a smoky corner of the Blue Lantern, watching Maggie Miller on stage, her voice carrying the same notes through the crowd. Did he recognize the flourish in the middle? Did it belong to both of them somehow, a shared creation? Or was it hers alone, a mark she left on everything she touched? The song wound down, leaving a silence that felt almost too large for the room. Emily closed the lid gently. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself forever, but telling her father now felt like the fastest way to make the trail go cold. He'd shut it down, maybe even take the music box away, under the guise of keeping it safe. No, this was her path to walk. She gathered the letter, the photo, and the key, tucking them into a padded envelope for safekeeping. She slipped the envelope into her backpack along with her laptop. If she was going to find David Miller, she'd need more than just a name and a hunch. She'd need a starting point. Her first search was predictable: David Miller. New York Jazz, 1960s. The results were overwhelming. Articles, obituaries, social media profiles, too many to sort through without narrowing it down. She added Blue Lantern to the search. That's when the first real lead appeared. An archived newspaper clipping from April 1966. It scanned grainy but readable. Popular jazz venue. The Blue Lantern bids farewell to local singer Maggie Miller after final performance. The article was short, more of a club announcement than a profile. but it mentioned a David Miller house pianist. Emily's pulse jumped. House pianist. That meant he wasn't just some random admirer, he'd been part of her grandmother's world, night after night. She kept digging. An image search turned up a black and white promotional photo for the Blue Lanterns' 1965 fall season. There he was again, David Miller, standing at the far end of the piano suite, slightly rumpled, smiling like he'd just been caught in the middle of a joke. Maggie was there too, center stage in a fitted dress, her hair swept up, holding a microphone. They looked like a team. A knock at her door made her snap the laptop shut. "M." Rachel's voice warm but curious. "We're starting dinner." "Coming?" Emily called back. She glanced at the photo on her desk before sliding it under a stack of sketchbooks. Some things were too new, too fragile to share just yet. At dinner, conversation drifted to ordinary things. The weather, the price of lobster at the docks, a neighbor's new boat. Emily let her parents talk, nodding when necessary, her mind miles away in a smoky jazz club 50 years ago. Every now and then, she caught her father looking at her with that same measuring gaze he'd had that morning, as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. When the meal was over, she helped clear the table, rinsed her plate, and retreated upstairs. She pulled the photo out again, laying it flat on the desk beside the music box. The rain had started up once more, tapping a rhythm against the glass. She thought of Henry Adams's words. "If your grandmother wanted something found, she left a trail." Emily was starting to believe it. The music box, the key, the letter, the photo, these weren't just keepsakes. They were coordinates. And the map was pointing straight to New York. She didn't know what she would find there. An old man with fading memories, a story half told, or maybe nothing at all. But she knew one thing: she had to go. She reached for her phone and pulled up a travel site, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could leave in a few days. She could make it a quick trip, just to see. The thought sent a shiver of anticipation through her. The same feeling she used to get as a kid, right before opening a gift she'd been told not to touch. On her nightstand, the music box waited. She wound it one more time before bed, letting the notes carry her into sleep. Somewhere in another city, someone else might remember that melody. And maybe, just maybe, they'd been waiting for her too. 3 days later, Emily was on a northbound Amtrak, the scenery sliding past in streaks of gray and green. The morning fog still clung to the coast, swallowing the edges of the world outside her window. Her backpack sat on the seat beside her, the padded envelope with the photo and letter tucked safely inside. The music box was wrapped in layers of a soft sweater, its weight steady and reassuring. She'd told her parents she was meeting a friend in the city for a few days. It wasn't a complete lie, she just hadn't specified that the friend was a man she'd never met, who might be old enough to be her grandfather, and who might also be the only person alive who knew the truth about Margaret Miller. The train curved inland, the rhythm of the tracks tapping beneath her feet. Emily opened her laptop, the Blue Lantern photo pulled up again. She'd memorized every detail: the marquee, the street lamp to the left, the brickwork pattern on the club's facade. Through some digging in public archives, she'd found the club's old address, McDougal Street, in Greenwich Village. Now it was an art gallery, but she figured it was the best place to start. New York met her with its usual wall of sound taxi horns, snippets of street music, the constant murmur of conversations in a dozen languages. The February air was sharper here, bouncing between the buildings and carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from a cart on the corner. Emily checked into a modest hotel in the village, dropped her bag, and walked the few blocks to where the Blue Lantern had once stood. The gallery, now occupying the space, was bright and minimalist, white walls hung with abstract paintings. But the bones of the building were the same: the narrow doorway, the brass railings on the steps, the way the light fell across the front window. She stood there for a long moment, trying to imagine it 50 years earlier, awash in neon and cigarette smoke. A woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled into a bun, noticed her lingering. "Can I help you?" she asked, stepping onto the threshold. "I'm looking for information about what used to be here," Emily said. It was a jazz club. The Blue Lantern. The woman's eyes warmed with recognition. "Oh, yes. My parents came here in the 60s. I was just a kid, but I remember the music spilling out onto the street." She tilted her head. "Why do you ask? My grandmother sang here. Maggie Miller." At that, the woman's brows lifted. Maggie Miller. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years. She tapped her chin. "You should talk to Leon. He played trumpet in the house band back then. Still lives in the neighborhood, runs a little record shop on Bleecker Street." Emily's pulse quickened. "Could you give me the address?" The record shop was a narrow, dimly lit space, every inch lined with vinyl rows and rows of jazz blues soul. Behind the counter, a tall man in a flat cap was humming along to a Duke Ellington track playing softly from an old turntable. His skin was the color of polished walnut, his posture straight despite the years in his face. "Leon," Emily asked. "That's me," he said, his voice warm and gravelly. "What can I do for you?" She introduced herself, then slid the Blue Lantern photo across the counter. "That's my grandmother, Maggie Miller." Leon's eyes softened immediately. "Well, I'll be damned. Maggie." He picked up the photo carefully as if it might crack under the weight of memory. "Haven't seen her face in decades. She was a hell of a singer." "You knew her?" "Knew her," Leon chuckled. "I shared a stage with her 5 nights a week for nearly 2 years. And that man next to her, David Miller, our pianist." Emily leaned forward. "Do you know where I can find him?" Leon set the photo down, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. "David?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Last I heard, he was still in the city. Retired from music in the 70s. Did some teaching, played the occasional wedding. I ran into him maybe 10 years ago, looked good for his age. Lived uptown near Riverside. Do you have an address?" Leon shook his head. "Afraid not, but I do have something that might help." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a worn, leather-bound address book. Flipping through, he stopped at a page and tapped a line. "Here's his old number. Might still be active. And if not, well, people leave trails, especially musicians." Emily copied it down her hand, trembling slightly. "Thank you for everything." Leon smiled, sliding the photo back to her. "If you find him, tell him Leon says hello. And tell him Maggie's granddaughter has her eyes." Back in her hotel room, Emily stared at the number on a scrap of paper. It felt absurdly small for the weight it carried. She picked up her phone, dialed, and held her breath as it rang. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then a voice deep slower than she expected with a faint rasp. "Hello?" Her mouth went dry. "Hi, is this David Miller?" A pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Emily Carter. I think you knew my grandmother, Margaret Miller." The silence that followed was heavy. She could hear the faint city noise through the line sirens, far off a horn, the rumble of traffic. When he spoke again, his voice had changed quieter, more careful. "Margaret's granddaughter," he said, as if testing the words. "It's been a long time since anyone said her name to me. I think she wanted me to find you," Emily said. "She left me a note. And a music box." Another pause, then a sound that might have been a sigh or a laugh, low and wistful. "The rose on the lid, yes. I see." The line went quiet again. Then, "Meet me tomorrow. There's a cafe on West End and 92nd corner table by the window. 10 o'clock. I'll be there," Emily said. But he had already hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in her hand. Outside, the city moved on without her. But inside, she could feel it. Something had shifted. Tomorrow, she would look into the eyes of the man who had known her grandmother's truth. And maybe at last, she'd hear the rest of the song. The cafe on the corner of West End and 92nd looked like it had been there forever. Brick facade, green awning faded from years of sun, the smell of fresh bagels wafting onto the street. The next morning, Emily stood outside for a moment, bracing herself. New York was already fully awake around her delivery trucks, unloading crates of produce, a jogger, weaving through pedestrians, the muffled roar of the subway beneath her feet. She pulled the padded envelope from her backpack, checked that the photo and letter were still inside, and stepped through the glass door. The bell above it chimed softly. Inside the cafe was warm and crowded with a low murmur of conversation, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine. At the far corner by the window, a man sat alone, a mug cradled between his hands. Even before she reached the table, she knew it was him. David Miller had the kind of presence that made the space around him feel deliberate. His hair was silver white, combed neatly back from a broad forehead. Lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth spoke of both laughter and loss. He wore a charcoal sweater over a collared shirt. And when he looked up, his gaze, sharp assessing, seemed to hold both welcome and caution. "Emily Carter," he said, as though confirming a theory. His voice was deeper than over the phone, textured like an old record. "Sit." She slid into the chair opposite him, setting her backpack at her feet. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded once. "When someone says Margaret's name after this many years, I pay attention." He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes never leaving hers. "You look like her, you know. Same shape to the eyes. But your mouth, that's your father's." Emily's chest tightened. "You knew my dad. I met him once. He was..." What 10 Margaret kept him close. Protective, maybe too much. He leaned back, studying her. "She never talked about me to you, I take it." "She didn't talk about her past at all," Emily admitted. "My father doesn't either. But she left me something." She reached into her backpack and brought out the music box, unwrapping it from the sweater. She set it gently between them. David's hand hesitated in midair before he touched it. His fingers traced the carved rose with a tenderness that made Emily's throat ache. "I gave her this," he murmured. "The night before she left New York. We'd just finished a set at the Blue Lantern. I knew she was going, though she wouldn't tell me why." Emily opened the lid. The familiar melody spilled into the air between them. People at nearby tables glanced over, smiling faintly at the unexpected music. "She told me this song would explain more than words ever could," Emily said quietly. David's gaze went distant, following the tune somewhere far away. "It was our song," he said. "Not because we wrote it, we didn't, but because she changed it. That little run in the middle, that was hers. She said every good song needs one secret." The dancer spun in her slow orbit. Emily leaned forward. "She left me a note in a hidden compartment. It said, 'The truth is in New York, find David Miller.' So I did." His eyes came back to hers, sharp again. "And now, you want to know why she left?" "Yes." He sighed, the sound low and heavy. Margaret was on the edge of something big in '66. A record deal, tours. The whole machine was about to grab hold of her. She was ready for it. And then her brother got into trouble. James, Emily said she'd seen the name in earlier letters. David nodded. He was young, angry at the world, marching in protests. Got caught in the wrong place during a rally that turned violent. The police wanted to make an example. Charges that could have ruined him, maybe worse. Emily's pulse quickened. What does that have to do with her leaving? She had a choice, David said. Stay in New York and take her shot at the career she'd fought for, or go back home, marry a man with influence, and use that marriage to get her brother out. She didn't hesitate. Emily blinked. Marry a man? You mean my grandfather? Yes. He was older, wealthy, had the kind of political connections that could make charges vanish. It was a transaction. She traded her life here for James's freedom. He paused, then added, and she never came back. The dancer slowed to a stop. The cafe noise pressed in again. Emily struggled to picture it, her grandmother radiant on stage, walking away from all of it for family. Why didn't she tell anyone? Even my dad. David's eyes softened. Because she wanted her son to see her as more than the choices she made. And maybe because part of her didn't want to reopen that door. She closed it, locked it, and left the key in your hands. Emily glanced at the music box, the key, the photograph she'd brought. She left the trail for me. She must have trusted you to follow it, David said. Margaret never did anything by accident. For a moment they sat in silence, the city moving beyond the window in a blur of taxis and pedestrians. Emily felt the weight of the story settle on her, not as a burden, but as something she was meant to carry. What happened to her brother? She asked. He moved west, started over. Kept out of trouble as far as I know. Wrote to her once a year, birthdays and Christmas. She kept every letter. David's mouth curved faintly. She forgave him. I'm not sure she ever forgave herself. Emily closed the lid of the music box. Thank you for telling me. David leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. If you want to understand her fully, you need to know this. She loved fiercely, but she was afraid of being trapped. That's why the stage suited her freedom in the spotlight. When she gave that up, a part of her never stopped singing, even if no one could hear. As they stood to leave, David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. I kept this, he said. Didn't know if I'd ever give it to anyone. But I think it's yours now. Emily took it carefully. Inside was a faded program from the Blue Lantern, an evening with Maggie Miller, and a handwritten set list in her grandmother's script. At the bottom, in smaller letters, it said, "For D, until we meet again." Her eyes blurred. She slipped the envelope into her bag, the edges warm from his hand. I'll take care of it. David smiled a little sadly. That's all she ever wanted? They stepped out into the cold air. The city roared around them, but Emily felt strangely quiet inside. She had more answers now, but also more questions about who her grandmother had been, about what it meant to love enough to give everything up. And as she walked away, the weight of the music box in her bag felt less like a mystery to solve and more like a legacy to honor. David had suggested they walk. The cafe's warmth gave way to the sharp winter air as they headed toward Riverside Park. The Hudson River lay ahead, its surface broken into dark silver by the wind. Emily kept pace beside him, the music box secure in her backpack. Each step feeling like it was pulling her deeper into a story she had only just begun to understand. After a few blocks, David slowed, resting a hand on the back of a bench dusted with frost. You want to know about the last night? He asked. Emily nodded. If you're willing to tell me. He sank onto the bench, motioning for her to join him. It's not the kind of story you tell quickly, he said. It's a night you have to walk through slowly, like you're back there again. The Blue Lantern, March 14th, 1966. It was a Monday. David began his gaze shifting away from the present, settling somewhere decades behind them. Mondays were quieter than weekends, less noise from the crowd, more room for the music to breathe. Maggie liked that. Said you could hear the truth in a song better without the clinking glasses and the shouting. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I knew she was leaving, though. She never said the word. You feel it when someone's halfway out the door. She carried herself differently that week, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Like she was memorizing every face, every note. The band had warmed up on stage, Leon on trumpet, Benny on bass, Frankie on drums. David took his place at the piano, running his fingers over the keys like a ritual. Maggie appeared from backstage in a deep blue dress, the kind that caught the light, and made her look like she'd stepped out of the smoke curling through the club. She opened with Autumn in New York. David said, smiling faintly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes, they kept searching the room. I knew she was looking for the strength to do what she had to do. As the set went on, they played their usual favorites. Between songs, Maggie's laughter drifted over the mic, but David could see the flickers of thought crossing her face moments when she wasn't quite with them, already standing in some other life. Then came the last song. She turned to me, David said softly, and mouthed, "Our song." The opening notes of Claire de Lune, her version, flowed from the piano. She didn't sing. She let the melody stand alone. But when that small signature run came in the middle, her gaze found his, and it felt like the whole room disappeared. I'd been holding onto the music box for weeks, David said. I found it in a little shop in Paris during a tour the year before. The rose reminded me of her. I had the craftsman adjust the mechanism to include that run in the song, her run, so it would always be hers. After the final note, the applause was softer than usual, almost reverent. Maggie stepped off stage, and David followed. In the narrow hallway backstage, she was already removing her earrings, her hands trembling just slightly. "You played it perfectly," she told him. "And you sang it perfectly," he replied. "That's why I have something for you." He pulled the wrapped box from his coat pocket. She frowned, then smiled as she opened it, revealing the music box inside. "David?" Her voice caught on his name. She ran her fingers over the rose, tracing it like a map. "It's beautiful." "Wind it," he said. She did. And when the first notes filled the hallway, her smile faltered, replaced by something deeper. "You added it," she whispered. "You deserve to have your song somewhere. It can't be forgotten," he said. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. "You don't know how much this means." "I think I do," he said quietly. They didn't talk about her leaving, not directly. But as they stood there, the music circling them, it was all they were talking about. Finally, she closed the lid and slipped the box into her bag. "I'll keep it," she promised. "And when someone I love needs to hear the truth, I'll let it play." David hesitated. "I wish you'd stay." She shook her head. "You'd wish me to be someone I'm not, if I did. And I can't do that to either of us." It wasn't an argument. It was an acknowledgement. They returned to the stage for a final bow. No announcement of farewell, no grand gesture, just a look they shared that said everything. Back in the park, David's voice softened. I never saw her again after that night. A few postcards unsigned, but unmistakably hers. Once a photograph of a garden with a single white rose in bloom. That was her way of saying she was all right. Emily felt the weight of the story settle into her. The image of her grandmother in that blue dress, walking away with the music box in her bag, was so vivid it hurt. "You gave her a piece of yourself," she said. David nodded. "And she gave me one in return. I still play that arrangement sometimes late at night, always with the run in the middle." Emily thought of the letter hidden inside the box, the trail that had led her here. "She wanted me to know," she murmured. "Then you should do something with it," David said. "Stories like this, they vanish if no one carries them forward." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the river move under the gray winter sky. Finally, David stood, pulling his coat tighter. "You have her courage, Emily. Use it." She rose too, shouldering her backpack. "Thank you for trusting me with this." He smiled faintly. It was never mine to keep. They parted at the park entrance, David walking uptown, Emily heading back toward the subway. She felt the music box's weight against her back with every step, not just wood and brass now, but an entire night in 1966, pressed into something she could carry. And she knew she was done just collecting the pieces of the story. It was time to decide what to do with them. Emily sat still, not interrupting, as David continued to reminisce. He spoke slowly, as if pulling each fragment of memory out of a cabinet that had been locked for over half a century. After I gave her the music box, David said I knew I had only a few hours left. Maggie went back to the dressing room to change, and I sat alone at the piano, letting my hands wander over the chords we used to rehearse together. I thought, if I played it one more time, maybe she'd change her mind. He smiled faintly, tinged with sadness. But when she came back wearing that gray wool coat and a scarf, I knew the decision was final. Maggie was not the kind of person you could sway once she'd chosen her path. They stepped out the side door of the Blue Lantern, the street still damp from a light drizzle. The street lamps cast a pale gold over the puddles stretching their shadows across the brick. We didn't talk much, David continued. Every word felt like it might shatter something fragile. I walked her a few blocks to the corner where a taxi was waiting. Before getting in, Maggie turned to look at him, not the usual farewell glance, but one that seemed to carve his image deep into her memory. She put her hand over her heartbeat. David pressed his hand to his chest to show her and said, "I'll hear this in every turn of the music box." Emily swallowed hard, feeling the beauty and ache in those words. "And you believed her?" David nodded gently. "I did. And I was right. Every time I think of her, I don't just remember her face or her voice. I remember that heartbeat hidden in every note of Claire de Lune she'd marked as her own." He pulled out an old handkerchief from his pocket, its edges frayed with a white rose embroidered in the corner. That night, when she hugged me for the last time, Maggie slipped this into my coat pocket. No note, no message. Just a piece of herself. Emily stared at the cloth, feeling as though she were seeing part of the music box in fabric form instead of wood. David chuckled softly. People think goodbyes are promises to meet again. But for Maggie, they were acts of entrustment. She gave me a memory, and I gave her the box. We both knew neither of us would take it back. Emily asked, "Did you ever try to find her after that?" "Yes," David admitted. 2 years later, when I heard James's charges had been dropped, I thought she might come back. I went to her hometown in Maine, but..." He sighed. Maggie was already married to Thomas Carter Sr., living in the house near the harbor with a little boy about 4 years old, your father. Emily felt the air thicken. "Did you see her?" "No." I stood across the street and watched her lead her son into the garden. She looked peaceful. No stage lights, but a different kind of serenity. I didn't want to disturb that. I turned away. He looked at Emily, his gaze firm. "Do you understand? This story isn't just romance. It's about sacrifice." She boxed away a part of herself to protect others. "If you take this story out into the world, remember that." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "I won't let anyone misunderstand her. But I think she wanted me to know and to tell it." David smiled sadly. If not, she wouldn't have left the key. Suddenly, he stood gesturing for Emily to follow. They walked a few more minutes to a small pawn shop, its windows fogged with condensation. Inside, David spoke briefly with the owner, before returning with a long, narrow wooden box. "Open it," he said. Emily carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a handwritten music score, the paper yellowed with age, titled Claire de Lune, Maggie's arrangement. In the bottom corner was a signature MM. The arrangement she rewrote, David explained. I kept it here thinking one day someone would need it. And today is that day. Emily ran her fingers lightly over each note, feeling as though she were touching her grandmother's own hands. Back at her hotel, her emotions were tangled, moved, regretful, but also powerfully compelled. The story was no longer scattered fragments. It was becoming a complete picture with the music box as the frame. And at the center, the image of a woman who chose family over the stage lights. That night before sleeping, Emily placed the score next to the music box and opened the lid to let the melody play. For the first time, she truly heard her grandmother's distinctive flourish and pictured that farewell night at the Blue Lantern. When a gift changed hands and both people understood they had just closed a chapter of their lives. Emily returned to Maine on a late winter afternoon. The road into the small town was the same as ever, but everything inside her had changed. In her backpack, the music box, the photograph, the letter, and her grandmother's handwritten arrangement were like a new kind of luggage, not just objects, but a story brought back to life. Her father was in the backyard when she arrived, fixing the fence, the hammer striking a steady rhythm against the wood. Emily stood on the porch for a moment watching. His broad back, his hair more silver than she remembered. She realized she had never seen him look as small as he did now, with the evening shadows stretching around him. "You're back," Thomas said, without turning, as if he'd known she was there all along. "Yes," Emily replied, stepping down from the porch. "We need to talk." He set the hammer aside, wiped his hands on his jeans. His eyes met hers, still quiet, but not entirely closed off this time. "Come inside." In the living room, they sat facing each other. Emily placed the music box on the table between them as undeniable evidence. "I went to New York," she began. "I met David Miller." The name made him frown slightly. "He's still alive, he is. And he told me everything. About Grandma. About her last night at the Blue Lantern. About why she left music." Thomas leaned back in his chair, silent. Outside, the wind off the ocean hissed past the eaves. She married Grandpa. Emily continued, not for love, but because she could save James. "I know this is hard to hear, but I think you deserve to know." Thomas's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly. "You think I didn't know?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I knew. She told me part of it. But back then I was too young to understand. I only saw a mother, distant, and I was angry at her for that." Emily leaned forward. "You never asked her, I did. But she stayed silent. She told me that one day I'd understand. I thought she was wrong until you brought this music box back." Emily opened the lid, letting the melody play. The air in the room seemed to soften, yet grow heavier. "She left her mark on this song," Emily said. "The little run in the middle that was hers. I heard it from David and from her own handwritten arrangement." Thomas stared at the tiny dancer turning inside the box. "She used to play it for me when I was little. But back then I didn't know how special it was. I just remember it made me feel safe." He inhaled deeply. Maybe that was her way of saying, "I love you." Emily felt her throat tighten. She didn't want this story to be buried. She believed I'd find the truth and share it, but also protect it. Thomas was quiet for a long time before saying, "You've done well, Emily. You've found the part of my mother I could never reach." After a moment, he stood and walked to the wooden cabinet in the corner, rummaging until he pulled out a small box. He set it on the table. Inside were several old letters, each one addressed from James Carter. "These were sent to your grandmother," Thomas explained. "She kept every one. I've never read them. Maybe it's time." Emily opened one, reading the first few lines. James, thanking her for saving him, promising to live a life worthy of her sacrifice. The handwriting was shaky, but resolute. Thomas glanced at her. See? She never needed the world to know as long as the people she saved were happy. They sat in silence, listening to the music win toward its final notes. When the dancer stilled, Thomas said softly, "I wish I could tell her I understand. But maybe you've done that for me." Emily closed the box, smiling sadly. "I think she knows, and she'd smile to hear you say that." That night, after her father had gone upstairs, Emily stayed in the living room, playing the tune once more. Moonlight streamed through the window, falling over the carved rose on the lid. She realized this story wasn't just her grandmother's or her father's, it was hers now too. A legacy of sound love and sacrifice. And she knew she would carry it further still. The idea came to Emily late at night, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. She was lying in bed, the music box on the nightstand, the dancer frozen mid-turn. The truth she'd uncovered over the past weeks was too precious to keep sealed away in an attic or between the pages of a notebook. Her grandmother's story was more than a family secret. It was an act of courage, an example of love that demanded to be remembered. By morning, the idea had crystallized. She would create something tangible, something public to honor Margaret Carter's life. Not the sanitized version that had been told in whispers, but the real human story of Maggie Miller, the young woman who gave up a dazzling future to save her brother and quietly raised a family in the shadow of her sacrifice. She began sketching it out at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold beside her. Phase 1. Digitize and preserve. Emily carefully photographed the music box from every angle. The carved rose, the tiny ballerina, the brass plate with MM. She scanned the handwritten arrangement of Claire de Lune, making sure every curve of her grandmother's notation was crisp and clear. She transcribed the letter to David Miller, keeping the folds and creases visible in the digital copy. Phase 2. Gather voices. She called Leon in New York, asking if he would share his memories on record. He agreed instantly, even offering to dig up old recordings from the Blue Lantern. She reached out to David again this time with a formal interview request. He laughed and told her she was turning into a reporter. But his voice softened when he said, "If it's for Maggie, I'll talk as long as you need." Phase 3. Create a space. Her grandmother's story needed a home somewhere people could encounter it without having to know the family. Emily envisioned a small gallery space in town, maybe a corner of the library, or an unused storefront by the harbor. The music box would sit at the center under a glass case, always wound just enough for the melody to play once an hour. Around it, photographs, letters, and audio recordings would tell the story in fragments like puzzle pieces visitors could put together themselves. When she told her mother, Rachel listened quietly, her fingers curled around her tea mug. She would have been proud, she said at last. Not just for what you're making, but for how you're telling it. Truthfully, kindly. Her father was slower to respond. When she showed him the rough sketches of the exhibit layout, he studied them for a long moment. "It's strange," he said, finally. "All my life I thought her silence was a wall. Now I see it was a choice. Maybe this is her way of finally speaking." That night he went into the attic and came back down with a shoebox Emily had never seen. Inside were photos of Margaret. She'd never encountered her at the piano, her in the garden, her holding a baby Thomas in her lap. "You'll want these," he said simply. The project began to take on a life of its own. Friends offered to help with design and carpentry. The local historical society donated display cases. A former librarian, now retired, volunteered to curate the written materials. Emily designed a poster for the exhibit, A Rose in the Song. The life of Maggie Miller, Margaret Carter. An intimate look at a voice that chose love over fame. In the corner of the poster, she placed the carved rose from the music box rendered in warm sepia. On the opening day, the small gallery space smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. Sunlight spilled in through the tall windows, catching on the glass case where the music box sat. The first visitors trickled in, neighbors, friends, curious passers-by. Emily stood to the side, letting people discover the story for themselves. She watched an elderly woman lean in close to the letter to David Miller, her lips moving silently as she read. She saw a young couple listening to Leon's voice through a pair of headphones, nodding in time to the jazz track playing in the background. And every hour, when the mechanism inside the music box clicked to life, the melody filled the room. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. The familiar notes floated through the air, carrying that distinctive flourish in the middle. Emily noticed how people seemed to linger in that moment, as if the music was speaking directly to them. Late in the afternoon, David Miller himself arrived. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but his eyes lit up when they landed on the display. Emily guided him to the music box. "She still looks good," he said, smiling at the carved rose. When the tune began, he closed his eyes. "Still plays true, too." He took Emily's hand. "You've given her voice back." "She never really lost it," Emily said. "It was just waiting for the right moment to be heard." When the last visitors left and the lights dimmed, Emily stood alone in the gallery. The music box sat in its pool of soft light. The dancer poised for her next turn. She thought of her grandmother on that final night in New York, slipping the music box into her bag, walking into the rain with her choice made. Now, decades later, that choice had bloomed into something new. A space where strangers could meet her, not just as a figure in a family photo, but as a woman who lived, loved, and left a legacy in song. Emily reached into the case, gave the key a gentle turn, and listened as the melody rose once more, carrying the past into the present. This was no longer just her grandmother's story. It was everyone's. Winter in Maine had a way of slowing everything down. The harbor lay quiet under a pale sky. Fishing boats rocking gently in the tide, their masts clicking softly like an old metronome. Emily stood in the doorway of her small cafe gallery, the rose and lantern, watching the light spill across the wooden floors inside. It had been 3 months since the exhibit opened. What started as a memorial project had grown into a living, breathing space. The front half of the shop served coffee, tea, and warm blueberry muffins. The back half remained devoted to Margaret Carter, Maggie Miller, the music box, and the story that had traveled from New York's smoky jazz nights to this quiet coastal town. Every morning before unlocking the front door, Emily wound the key in the music box and let the melody drift through the air. The sound seemed to weave itself into the day, into the way sunlight hit the glass display, into the conversations of strangers meeting over their first cups of coffee. Some days locals came in just to hear it play. Other days, tourists, having read about the gallery in a travel blog or seen it tagged on social media, would wander in, surprised, to find themselves moved by a story they hadn't expected to encounter on vacation. Emily loved watching people's faces when they reached the hidden flourish in the song, that little run her grandmother had added decades ago. Some smiled without knowing why. Others blinked rapidly, as if fighting back tears. One afternoon, a young woman lingered at the display long after the music had stopped. She finally turned to Emily, eyes shining. "My grandmother gave up a career in theater to raise my mom. No one ever talked about it. I think I understand her better now." Emily smiled gently. "That's why the story is here, so people can find their own reflections in it." In the weeks since the opening, Emily had added more to the collection. Leon had sent her a reel of old Blue Lantern recordings, scratchy but full of life, and she'd placed a listening station next to the display. David Miller, too frail now to travel, mailed her a small box of keepsakes, a program from a benefit concert, a napkin with Maggie's lipstick print, a black and white candid photo of her, laughing mid-song. Her father visited often. At first, he would simply sit in the corner with a coffee watching the room without saying much. But over time, he began sharing small stories about his mother, memories he had never spoken aloud before. The day she taught him how to whistle, the time she stayed up all night sewing him a costume for a school play. Emily realized that telling the truth about Margaret's sacrifice hadn't just given the world her story. It had given her father a way to reconnect with the mother he'd lost long before she passed away. One particularly cold morning, Emily was refilling the pastry case when the doorbell chimed. She looked up to see a girl of about 12 walk in clutching a school notebook. She approached the counter shyly. "Are you the lady who knows the story about the music box?" the girl asked. "I suppose I am," Emily said with a smile. "Would you like to hear it?" The girl nodded. "We have to write an essay about someone who inspires us. My mom told me about your grandma. I want to write about her." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Then you should. And I'll tell you everything you want to know." They sat together at one of the small tables, the music box between them, as Emily retold the story about Maggie's voice, the blue lantern, the choice she made for her brother. She didn't hide the bittersweet parts, because that was where the meaning lived. When the girl left, she turned at the door and said, "I think your grandma would be proud." Emily stood there for a moment after she was gone, letting the words settle. By spring, the cafe gallery had become a small hub for the community. Local musicians began offering to play in the evenings, weaving their own songs into the space. Some even learned Maggie's arrangement of Claire de Lune, playing it live on the small upright piano Emily had brought in. It struck Emily that this was how a legacy stayed alive, not by keeping it under glass, but by letting it breathe, change, and mingle with new voices. One evening, as she was closing up, Emily wound the music box for the last time that day. The melody rose, and she found herself humming along, matching her grandmother's flourish perfectly. Through the window, the harbor lights flickered like distant stars. She thought about the winding paths that had led here, Henry Adams's antique shop, the key in the attic, the letter, and photo the trip to New York, David's stories. All of it had converged into this place, into this moment. She realized that while the story had begun as hers, to discover it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it, everyone who had felt the weight of love and the cost of sacrifice in their own lives. As the last note faded, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Grandma." And in that pause, with the sea air drifting through the slightly open door, she could almost hear a voice humming in reply, soft, steady, carrying the shape of a smile. The dancer inside the music box stood poised for her next turn. Emily smiled back, because she knew the melody would go on.